Uh, let's start. As you've been notified through electronic means, this afternoon, Andrew Sullivan will be giving a SAFRA lecture about how advertising defeated journalism, which is basically the institutional corruption story about journalism. What we've found through non-scientific analysis is that people who show up to events like that tend to do better in grades. I don't know why, but anyway, this will be an incredibly interesting event. He is an amazingly powerful speaker, and this is an important subject for what we've been talking about. Okay, so you recognize Austin Hall is in the law school. Basically, if you go to the Science Center, and then you look to the left, the first law building you see, it's an old law building, is Austin Hall. And you walk in there, you'll see a sign for where that'll be. Okay, so today we're going to have a discussion about the ethics of the pharmaceutical industry. And we're going to have this discussion in the form of a debate, kind of playful, fun debate with my colleague Jennifer Miller. Jennifer is one of the SAFRA fellows. She was a fellow before this at the Global Health and Innovation Management Center at Fordham School of Business. She's also been a visiting lecturer at Columbia University's Bioethics and Cross-Cultural Education program. She completed a PhD in bioethics at Regina Apostolorum, which you know, of course, is the Vatican. There she is right there. No, that's not true. She also has a Bachelor of Science in Physics, so she's serious science, who will be debating with me the ethics of the pharmaceutical industry. I get the easy side of this debate. She gets the incredibly hard side of the debate. You can pick which of those you think that should be, but I know which side I think that is. And so we'll be going back and forth on 5 different questions in the course of our debate. But to introduce it, we have to think a little bit about incredible evolution in the history of pharmaceuticals and the level of scientific rigor that has gone into their production. It's really astonishing to recognize just how resistant medicine was to science for many, many years. There's this great, fantastic book, just blanking on the title, about Garfield, President Garfield. Not the cartoon character, but the president. You've never heard of the President Garfield because he was assassinated about 6 months into his administration, which was a true tragedy because he was probably the brightest president in the history of presidents. While in the White House, he penned an original proof to the Pythagorean theorem, which he submitted to the Smithsonian, and shortly after that was shot by some crazy guy. But he literally was killed by the doctors who worked on him, not murdered, but killed, in the sense that the doctors who worked on him refused to sterilize any of their instruments or their hands or anything else as they treated a gunshot wound for 6 weeks. They couldn't find the bullet, and for 6 weeks they would probe in the hole in his body trying to find the bullet. And eventually, of course, that led to him getting incredible infections and dying from those infections. Now, if he had not been president, he wouldn't have died. Because if he had not been president, if he'd been like a grunt in the Civil War, they would have just patched him up and let him move on with a bullet in his back, because it wasn't causing any inability for him to do anything. They just would have let it stay there. And he wouldn't have been infected. So the doctors, because he was president, had to treat him so extensively to his ultimate demise. But this is significant because this is about 20 years after Lister in London had proven that sterilization was incredibly effective in avoiding infections. They had adopted at the University College of London the technique of sterilization and radically improved surgeries, and the obvious reasons, it's pretty intuitive to us. But American medicine refused to believe this, refused to believe the numbers, didn't believe science, that the practice of medicine be governed by numbers like this. Lister would say there are these tiny, tiny things that are causing the infections, and American doctors would say, oh yes, you're telling me there are invisible things that are causing infections, where 100 years ago, people used to talk about spirits causing infections. We got over that, and we're not going to believe your invisible things. It took many, many years before the facts had the effect that they were supposed to have. But then over the history of drugs, there has been an enormous embrace of science as the basis for determining whether something should be permitted as a treatment or not. And the critical gold standard innovation is something called the randomized controlled trial. And so we were going to just do a little introduction to the RCTs. I was really excited because I found a rap version of the introduction to the RCTs. But I should have been cued into the fact that only 140 people had seen it, that it really isn't very good.
Everything is gold when you got placebo.
This is not by somebody here, is it?
Bouncing on my people. Power grows.
Anyway, if you listen to it, it's really quite compelling, but we're not going to listen to it.
Randomized trials are really the only valid way to
Here's a couple
assess the
minutes to introduce it.
treatment. And the reason for this is that when we don't randomize, there's all kinds of confusion that's created by what we call confounders, various other types of factors that impact on treatments and outcomes. And the only way that we can get rid of this noise, so to speak, is by randomizing. I'll give you an example of a study that we're doing right now at the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. We're wondering whether or not it's more appropriate to treat high blood pressure aggressively, to get people who have high blood pressure, get their blood pressure down to 120, or whether it's okay to get their blood pressure down to 140 and that's all that one has to do. So the way that we're answering this question is we're doing a big randomized trial called SPRINT. We're going to take about 10,000 people and we're going to randomize them to very aggressive blood pressure control or more conservative blood pressure control. And then we'll see what happens. We're going to see how many people have strokes, how many people have heart attacks, and that will answer for us whether or not more aggressive blood pressure control is better or not. Well, the most important thing is to make the trial big. When you have large numbers, the likelihood of biases goes down. Now, there are some other things that one has to do as well. If one is testing drugs, one will compare against the placebo, and one engages in a practice called double blinding, whereby neither the patient nor the doctor knows what treatment they're actually getting. We also, when we follow people over time and make judgments about whether or not they have events like heart attacks or strokes, we try to make those judgments in a way that's blinded to the treatment assignment that a person got. So the investigator is trying to determine whether or not a person had a heart attack or stroke does not know what which arm they were randomized to.
So this turns out to be important and very complicated to do well. Because it's not only the fact that it's a large number, you've got to blind the participants in a particular way. I don't mean literally blind them, but the point is you need to make sure that the doctors don't know the drugs that are being given, the patient don't know whether the drugs are being given are real drugs. You've got to make sure that the procedures are completely rigorously applied. And because there are so many of these lines to draw, there's lots of potential for mistakes or something worse than mistakes. And that's what sets up a lot of the criticism around the way the potential for pharmaceutical involvement or industry involvement in the production of drugs has developed. Okay, so in the context of this debate, I'm going to ask Jennifer to come up in 1 second. We're going to look at 5 questions. We're going to look at clinical trial design, given this objective to set up the RCTs, how do companies actually design it? The actual conduct of the trial, so when you're carrying out the design, what's the way in which you do it? The fate of the results, how broadly or in what way are the results made available? Then more generally, the marketing practices around the drugs that you have tested. And finally, we're going to talk about the problem of the accessibility of drugs. So these are the 5 areas. We're going to go through this stylized laying out of these issues through this debate between the two of us, and then we'll have time, I hope, at the end for you to participate by your own pushback or debate or questions or whatever else. So with that, let me welcome to the stage Jennifer Miller. That's when you applaud. And the first topic of our debate is this question of clinical trial design. So here's the issue here. The complaints made against the pharmaceutical pharmaceutical industry. And that's the consistent line I'm going to be taking. Not necessarily the line I believe, but I'm hired to take that position today. And Jennifer's going to take the other side, not necessarily because that's what she believes, but because that's what we hired her to do today. We each are paid, well, I'm paid twice as much as you are for this, which is 0 times 0, and you're paid 0. Okay, but this is the issue. So I'm anti-pharmaceutical, she's pro-pharmaceutical. So the issue in the design is the claim that the companies are biasing the results by designing their trials to exaggerate the benefits and minimize the harms. And the reason they're doing that is they have an interest in proving that the drug is much more effective than maybe it is. So they do this in a couple ways, 2 ways in particular. Number one, they cherry pick research subjects who are likely to respond well to the drug that they are testing. So for example, drugs for something, I don't know how to pronounce it, it's COPD or COPD?
COPD.
COPD, which is basically things like bronchitis, are typically tested on research subjects who are not even 60 years old, have no what's called comorbidities or complications, when of course the people who will be using these drugs are typically more than 70 years old and have lots of comorbidities, meaning that it's going to look much better on the people they're testing it on than in fact it will look when it's out in the marketplace. Or they will cherry pick the research settings to inappropriately inflate the value of the drug. So this famous case of an osteoporosis drug, this is a drug dealing with bone weakness in bones. Obviously that's related to calcium levels in someone's body. So they tested this drug in this very small town in Brazil, where the inhabitants in this town, for one reason or another, on average had a much lower level of calcium than people in America, for example, have. So they start with a very low level of calcium. They give them these drugs. They see a very significant boost in the amount of calcium, and people attribute that to the drug, but in fact it's attributable to the fact that they cherry-picked the people they were going to test it on, and therefore saw a much more significant response. And the problem to this is that we don't yet have a systemic gatekeeper who's watching for this kind of bias. It's not that, as Peter Rothwell, who's a professor at Oxford, says, it's not the FDA's job, it's not the medical journal editor's job, it's not the IRB's job, it's nobody's job, which means that there's plenty of opportunity for the drug companies to engage in this kind of biasing, which produces views about the drugs or drugs that get tested and passed, which otherwise shouldn't be tested. That's a problem, and you're responsible for it. So I want you to answer that charge, Jennifer.
So what Professor Lessig says is actually true. When we do test drugs on subjects, we are cherry picking them. But there are 3 very valid reasons for why we cherry pick our research subjects. And the first one is science, the second one is a regulatory requirement, and the third one is a market-driven reason. So let's talk about the science. Just like the guy with the glasses in the video said, when you are trying to see cause and effect in a study, you have to limit your confounding variables. So to that means you cannot, it would be very hard to test a drug on people who have 10 different health problems and taking 10 different drugs, because you wouldn't have confidence in the clear cause and effect of your study. So therefore you do cherry pick your subjects. You try and find relatively healthier patients, perhaps than your average patient user, the end user of the drug. So that's a scientific reason. But let's talk about why we have this scientific method in place. It was actually imposed not by the scientists, but by the regulators and the FDA. So it was a legislative decision. There was a good reason for it. In the 1960s, late 1950s, early 1960s, there was this scandal called the thalidomide scandal. Does anyone know about it? Yeah. So there was a pill, and a lot of pregnant women were taking it. And if it was taken at a certain part of the pregnancy, a lot of the children that were born had deformities. Their hands would be attached to their shoulder joint, so it would look like a flipper, and the same thing would happen with their legs. And one of the reasons that we thought that we had this scandal was that we didn't have a proper, rigorous enough testing mechanism that clearly showed cause and effect. So the legislators came in and they said, you know, we're going to change the laws. They had some hearings in the 1960s, and in 1962 they passed a drug amendment, and in 1963 they refined it, and they said, look, drug companies, me, if you want to get your drug passed, you have to do 3 phases of studies, phase 1, 2, and 3. And you need to limit your confounding factors so there's a clear cause and effect so that the FDA can make a decision on whether to thumbs up, approve the drug, or not approve the drug. So it's scientifically required. It's now a regulatory requirement. But a third thing is, me as a company, it does not behoove me financially to artificially limit my market. When the FDA approves a drug, it approves the drug only based on the study. So if I test the drug on 35-year-old Asians who have really low calcium levels, or Brazilians who have really low calcium levels, to use Professor Lessig's example, then the FDA only approves the drug for people around the age of 35 who are Brazilian and who have certain low levels of calcium. So if I cherry pick my research subjects too much, my label, that's the prescription, the allowable prescription, what the company can market their products for, is similarly restricted. So it's not in my financial interest to artificially narrow my market. I want the largest market so that I can sell to the most amount of people possible and make the most amount of money.
So, but then that says that the incentives that you naturally have perfectly align with the public's interest in producing safe drugs. But I wonder if you think about the life cycle of drug development, if many of these drugs are being developed by smaller companies, which then might be bought by bigger companies. If the IBG, YBG phenomenon, I be gone, you be gone phenomenon, might make us less confident that the concern of the drug company is really the concern of the long-term interest of the drug company. Might there be an incentive in the short term for the company that is a small company expecting to be acquired to cut the corners necessary to get the drug out and be acquired so they can move on to something else?
Yeah, so I think we need to look at the drugs that the FDA approves every year. And so on average, let's say there's 38 drugs in 2012. That was a really record high number. There's less drugs approved in 2013, probably less this year. So you want to know how many of them were actually manufactured by really small biotech companies. And I think that number is pretty low. The large pharma companies do drive the market. So let's say there is a small percentage of pharmaceutical executives who do that. They're not executives, right? They're scientists. They often come from universities like Harvard.
Which we know, of course, has never had any
Impeccable
ethical
ethics.
scandals.
So now we're really not questioning the ethics of large pharmaceutical companies. We're actually questioning the ethics of researchers, scientists, right? Men and women in coats, lab coats. So that's somewhat of a different question. I'm representing large pharma, and I'm telling you that in large pharmaceutical companies, it doesn't happen.
So the only unethical people are the scientists, not the executives.
The smaller companies. Yeah.
Yeah.
But what you're actually saying is what happens to the drug post-approval. So I am saying that pre-approval, the incentives are not aligned for the pharmaceutical company to artificially narrow its markets by cherry-picking research subjects. But post-approval, there are cherry-picking for perhaps ethically questionable reasons. But they're, again, not driven by the pharmaceutical industry. They're driven by payers. So a lot of times, governments and insurance companies will ask for very narrow criteria in a subject. So, for example, China will often not approve a product unless it's been tested in China, which means that we have to go over to China, or there's a CRO actually in California that will try and find
A CRO?
Contract research organization, right? So, pharmaceutical companies don't do a lot of their testing in-house anymore. They hire a third party, a contract research organization. In some ways, the CRO takes the place of the academic scientist to test the medicine for them. And the CRO will cherry-pick research subjects depending on what the insurance or the payer wants. So if the insurance company wants to know if the product will work in 75-year-olds, then the pharmaceutical company will pay for a trial that only looks at 75-year-olds. But that's driven by payers. If nobody pays for the drug, it's hard to sell and gain access.
All right, so let's look at number 2, the conduct of the trials. So here the charge against the companies is that they will exploit the research subjects in developing countries in order to test their drugs. So in a couple of ways. Number one, they could be unresponsive to the needs of the local trial participants and populations. For example, they might be testing drugs in these developing nations that developing nations have no need for, like allergy drugs or male pattern baldness drugs, which are not the urgent medical need in these communities. What they need in these communities are drugs for tuberculosis or similar diseases, but that's not what's being tested. Or they might be testing these drugs in these communities without ever even intending to register and make the drugs available in these communities. So the communities are paying the price in the sense that they're the guinea pigs, but they're not getting the benefit in the sense that once the drug has been tested, they get to use the drug or take advantage of the drug. And then a completely different but really quite important complaint is that in the context of these clinical trials in developing nations, there's not a sufficient effort taken to get the kind of informed consent that ought to be taken if you're going to be testing something on somebody to determine its safety or effectiveness. So for example, there's a famous case, the Trovan case, which was the basis of a movie.
The Constant Gardener.
Yeah. The Constant Gardener, which I take it you've watched this movie a number of times as a drug company executive. It's not a happy story for drug companies, but anyway, the story that's behind it, Pfizer conducted a pediatric study, so a study for kids, on this antibiotic Trovan during this meningitis outbreak in Africa, in Kano, Africa. And then when this kid died of the drug, not the disease meningitis, but of consuming the drug, the parents claimed that they didn't know the kid was being tested with some experimental therapy. They were led to believe all they were getting was kind of free medical care that would make it so that their kid would not be subject or vulnerable to this particular disease. So the problem here is it's hard to know, it's hard to structure the consents to make it so that these people actually know what they're consenting to. And if you don't have consent, then it's pretty hard to justify the kind of risks that you would expose these people to. So that's different, of course, from the concern about whether you're making drugs available, but it's equally related to this fundamental concern of whether you're taking advantage of these developing nations in the context of making your enormous corporate profits.
So the main concern is that we're using citizens in third world countries, emerging markets, as guinea pigs to test drugs that they don't need, that we need. And I think about this a lot, actually, when I hold a white pill or I see people taking medicines. And here's what I think. I think that in order for a pharmaceutical company to conduct a clinical trial in a developing country, there are 6 gatekeepers it must go through, 6 gates. The IRB, it's an ethics committee, has to approve every clinical trial before it is conducted anywhere in the world. The local government has to sign off on the trial. The local scientists and doctors who generally treat that population have to give the okay. The company, our scientists, have to say, yes, we'll run that clinical trial. The local hospital where you run your clinical trial, and the local tribal leaders, if that's appropriate. Every one of those gatekeepers has to say, yes, this trial is ethical, responsive to the local population's needs, and it's going to help our community. So let's talk about IRBs, ethics committees, that committee that is one of the most important gatekeeper. They follow a lot of guidelines when they review a clinical trial. So before a company can start the trial, they have to write up a protocol. They have to say, this is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to do it, this is how we're going to get our informed consent, this is what our informed consent document looks like, this is how we're going to analyze the data, and this is what we hope that the trial, what type of indication we hope the drug will be approved for. So the IRB looks at the protocol, and it looks at the informed consent, and if that looks good, it checks that in the box. But then it follows the Helsinki Declaration, and the Helsinki Declaration is very clear that you cannot run a clinical trial in a population where the drug is not responsive to the local population's needs. So it's one of 10 principles that must be checked in the box before an ethics committee can approve a trial. So I would be very surprised if an ethics committee disregards one of the 10 major things that it needs to look for before it approves that trial. But let's talk about this word unresponsive. What does that mean? So if you look at India, where a lot of clinical trials, at least at one point, were being done, there's been a couple scandals there. What does the population look like in India? India actually shoulders 20% of the global burden of disease. It has 3 million cancer patients. It has 1 million new cancer cases per year. It has the largest population in the world for insulin resistance and obesity. It's the diabetes capital of the world, although China also claims that, so either China or India is. So it shoulders 30% of the global cases of diabetes. 80 million people suffer from cardiovascular disease there. It has 50 million asthmatics. So it's hard to understand what unresponsive means. There are probably bald people there too. So should they not have access to medicines for baldness? No. So what a company does is it of course makes sure that the trial is responsive to the local population's needs, but it also only conducts trials where it intends to market their product. So Professor Lessig's complaint was that companies run clinical trials in countries and then never intend to sell them. And in order to sell them, you register your product through the local regulator. That's simply not true. What actually happens is there's a delay, right? So in the ideal world, there would be one regulatory body that approves the medicine for use all over the world. But that is not the world we live in. Most nations, most countries have their own regulatory bodies, their own FDAs. And a company has to go to each of these regulatory bodies to gain marketing approval before it can sell its drug. So what it does is it prioritizes its list, usually US, then Europe, then Japan, and then it will go down the list. So it's not that it's not selling products or applying for regulatory approval. It's just not doing it perhaps from day one.
Okay, but then let's focus on this point that you made at the beginning in response to the point I was making at the end, which is that there are lots of different bodies that have to approve at each of these stages. What is the independence of these bodies? So, for example, the local community bodies. Do drug companies ever come in and say, we'll build a new school? Or, what's the relationship between those bodies and the drug companies?
So there's actually been a push for pharmaceutical companies to give back to the local communities in which they test drugs. And by give back, I mean more than allowing them free access to medicines that they test there. And part of that giving back is to, at times, contribute wings of hospitals to care for some of the cancer patients, or to donate ventilators for patients with lung problems. But that is not being pushed for nefarious, corrupting reasons.
How do you know that?
It's been pushed by Zeke Emanuel as who's one of very bright ethicists.
Who worked for Obama. He was in favor of the death panels, right?
Yeah, so if you want to, I served on a death panel. It's called a life panel. But, so Zeke Emanuel and many other brilliant, some would say, ethicists, have called for an increase in reciprocity, where because the community is shouldering some of the risks and burden in the drug development, that the companies have a responsibility to give back. And that's, I think, what you're talking about, that they are contributing to infrastructure. Another thing is, it's a win-win for the company and the community to improve infrastructure. What good is it to develop a vaccine that the millions of local population inhabitants need if they can't access it? Because what do vaccines need? What type of infrastructure? Yes, hospitals, and they're temperature sensitive. So what do you need you need a cold chain. You need access to continuous electricity, and you need a way to keep the vaccine cold. So a lot of pharmaceutical companies, they know it's not enough to make products. They have to make them accessible. So they will help build local infrastructure so people can access medicines.
Right, but so this dynamic of reciprocity is something that we've looked at in a bunch of different contexts when we think about something. I don't know if you've heard of this thing, institutional corruption, but that's what we're thinking about here. And the question is whether that dynamic of reciprocity creates a certain pressure on the participant, because you're a tribal leader, you look around, you see the communities that have opened up their population to this kind of testing. They get fancy new hospitals or fancy new electrical infrastructure. It's not unreasonable for you to conclude that if you don't, you won't, right? So is that creating a kind of pressure that makes it hard for them to evaluate independently the safety and effectiveness of this?
So I think in some ways this is part of a larger philosophical debate, right? So are we trying to promote the most amount of good from a public health and global health perspective that we can, or are we trying to minimize institutional corruption? And are they or are they not always compatible things? So if we are taking a lens, a sort of, it's not quite a utilitarian lens, but if you were to say we want to maximize the amount of health, then perhaps reciprocity is a good idea, and contributing to building reciprocity is a just way of getting to that means. But if, so I guess I'm saying, well, maybe there's a possibility that at times ethics committee, I wouldn't say the ethics committee, but I would say perhaps the local tribal leader is tempted to approve a trial that they think might be risky for a greater good. Now that's a philosophical question that we can talk about.
Unless you're that kid who died of that drug.
But I also want to say it's really hard. How is that tribal leader supposed to adequately adjudicate on the amount of risk that is inherent in the trial? But the type of trial we're talking about, by the time the trial gets to these developing countries, it's a phase 3 trial, which means it's already been tested in a good amount of people. And the likelihood of a pharmaceutical company conducting a phase 3 trial, which is really expensive, and it's the only trial, usually, that the FDA is going to use to decide whether it approves your drug or it doesn't approve its drug. So by the time the company decides to invest that much money in that phase 3 trial, which is run all over in 20 different spots, not just this one little town, it's pretty sure it's going to work, and the risks are pretty low. So I think if it happens, I think we're talking about a really small number of cases, outlier cases, not common.
Right, but if we wanted to avoid that, I guess we could push back on the first question, which is why we're doing this testing in the developing world. I mean, just like at the time when they didn't believe in drugs, they also believed that when you had drafts to war, it's okay for rich people to literally buy their way out of the draft. They send in, they sell their obligation by paying somebody else to take their obligation. We don't think that's fair right now. We think that creates all sorts of incentives for abuse. Why wouldn't we look at this situation and say it creates the same incentives for abuse, so that you're going to be testing your drugs, you need to be testing it proportionally everywhere, and that would at least force you to be subject to much more aggressive regulators who would be concerned to make sure that, whatever, we're not going to let people in, well, I don't know about New Jersey, but in Massachusetts be subject to all sorts of unbelievable risks. And if we forced the testing in New Jersey, not New Jersey, but in Massachusetts, then we'd be less concerned that there was this kind of pressure being placed on people who are desperate for 1,000 reasons, and this is just one way out of their desperation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so first of all, most clinical trials are done in the developed world. Okay, so we actually shoulder the majority of the burden of testing medicines. But increasingly, we are outsourcing this to other countries. Now, you could think of this outsourcing in a negative way, or you could think of it in a good way, which is one of the reasons that we're doing it, which is the science. Not every genetic marker or population responds the same way to drugs. So, for example, some cancer drugs work in some genetic populations and others don't. Some cancer drugs need to be given at dramatically different dosages for certain genetic populations than others, because genetics, for example, will determine the rate at which you metabolize a drug. Or it doesn't even have to be genetic populations. It could be very simple, like females metabolize sleeping pills at different rates than men. That's why sometimes the dosage is lower for women than men for some of the newer sleeping pills. But this is very important, and there's a whole field growing out of this called personalized medicine, where we want to understand how the medicines work for all of the different genetic populations out there. So since we live in a globalized world, it's only fair that we know how these medicines work around the world, not just for us comfortable Americans sitting in this classroom.
Wait, so you're saying it's only fairness? It has nothing to do with the cost?
So yes. So part of it is scientifically driven, that we need to understand how these medicines work in different populations, and part of it is it is absolutely cheaper, and sometimes faster to test in these developing countries. But faster and cheaper isn't a bad thing, right? Remember, it's a small section that are done in developing countries. Remember, the faster a drug is approved, the faster it gets to you in your hands. So if you're a cancer patient and none of the existing lines of therapies have worked for you, your fingers are crossed that medicine gets approved quickly and into your hand or into your veins, right? So it is in our interest to speed innovation, to have access to cures and therapy. So faster isn't bad unless it's faster that compromises quality and safety.
Okay, and then faster would also produce results more quickly, and results could be understood more quickly, but that brings us to our third topic. The charge against USORT is that pharmaceutical companies engage in practices to hide or to misrepresent the unfavorable clinical trials so that they're able to sell more products. There's one strand of this charge is that there's a certain bias in the reporting of results. Only about 50% of the trial results get reported in the NIH trial registry. And about 50% of clinical trials results are actually published. And when they're published, it tends to be the favorable results that are published. It's about 2 times more frequently than unfavorable results. And if these unfavorable results are published, they're published in very misleading ways. Joe Ross at Yale has showed that 99% of publications have discrepancies on critical items such as the reporting of adverse events. Now, this is a pretty significant public health problem. The IOM, Institute of Medicine in 2009, said that missing and misleading information, quote, puts millions of patients at risk of using ineffective and unsafe drugs, even for the common ailments like arthritis, depression, and high cholesterol. And it puts research subjects at risk as well. There's a infamous case of a drug, TGN 1412. Not a great marketing title for that drug, but there it is. 2006, they had a trial of this in London. 6 healthy volunteers take the drug. Within 1 hour, all 6 were sick. They had respiratory failure. Lungs began to fill with fluid. They stopped breathing properly. Their kidneys failed. All 6 were ventilated in intensive care and put on dialysis. Their fingers and toes turned black and began to rot and die. They all lived, but barely they lived. Now, you could say the question is, well, what should you do about it? The Department of Health said, well, the thing to do about it is to make sure that every single result gets published. And this is a very important case for that, because 10 years before the 2006 London incident, there was a similar molecule that had been tested just on one person, but that one person had suffered a similar fate, but that result hadn't been published, and had it been published, it's at least conceivable that the 6 would not have suffered as they did suffer. And indeed, the one was only discovered when somebody who was involved with it felt guilty about the fact that it wasn't published and came forward to link that story to the London story. So in this context, the way in which the results are being made available makes it harder for us to have confidence that the drugs, in fact, are drugs that should be safe.
Yeah, so I share Professor Lessig's concern about the 6 research subjects from the TGN case.
Great, let's go on.
But times have changed, right? The the original TGN molecule was tested in 1996. And 1996 was before we passed any laws, or the majority of the laws, around results disclosures. In 1997, we passed a set of laws in the United States that said all clinical trial results for life-saving therapies that are done in patients need to be disclosed. And then in 2005 and 2007, we expanded those rules to include every drug that's tested in patients. So if you look at the compliance rates of the industry as a whole for large companies, because I only represent large companies, the compliance rate is pretty good. It's about 80%. It should be 100. I absolutely agree with you. The FDA has a penalty. It's $10,000 a day for non-compliance.
How often have they?
That's right. The FDA has decided never to implement that penalty, but that is not my fault. But let's focus on the high compliance rate, which is 80%. And from my company, since I'm one of the top companies, we are 100% compliant. In fact, there's a significant portion of companies that are 100% compliant with that law. Most of the large companies disclose their clinical trial results for clinical trials that are done in patients.
Disclose the results, or?
Disclose the results.
So there are two statistics here, right? One is registering,
Yeah.
and the other is publishing the results.
So I think what you're really worried about, and what I did is I will show you my cards. So clinical trial, I said that all clinical trials in patients are required to be disclosed legally. But remember, if you know about how drugs are tested, not all trials are done in patients, right? There are 4 phases, but before a drug's approved, there are 3 phases. And really, it's phase 2 and 3 that are done in patients. Phase 1 is generally done in healthy volunteers. So what we're really talking about is, if you don't just look what's legally required to be disclosed, where compliance is pretty good, and you say, we want all clinical trial results, compliance plummets. I mean, there's no compliance, but disclosure rates are very low, say on average of 25%. And so the question is, because you said this is a public health concern, is do we need to know the 75% of clinical trial results that are invisible? So what do we know about those invisible 75% of trials? They're very small exploratory trials. They're not legally required to be shared, but me, as a big pharma company, I'm a member of a trade association called PhRMA, P-H-R-M-A, and we have a code of conduct, and we've gone way above the law. And in the code of conduct, we commit to disclosing all significant clinical trial results, which means that had that TGN case from 1996 taken place today, that would have been a significant result. If the first-in-man study was dangerous, that would have been disclosed, and we wouldn't have had that case in 2006 in London where 6 more subjects were exposed to that molecule. So I think this was a problem a long time ago, and it's not a problem today as much.
Well, okay, let's focus on the as much for a second. Because the standards of PhRMA, that trade organization,
Yeah.
which you said are above the requirements of the law, must be adopted because you guys think it's a good thing that this stuff be disclosed. What's the reason why companies would not disclose? What would the incentive be?
So I, of course, am in the best company, which there exists one in this category. I won't name the name, but there's one company that discloses all of its clinical trial results, and I work for that company. And so most companies, I would say about 10 years ago, it wasn't in our interest to disclose the early phase 1 clinical trial results because we considered them a trade secret. We didn't want our competitors to know what we were looking at. It's not that we didn't necessarily want them to know what we were testing, but we didn't want them to know the specifics, right? The dosing. You could have an idea about a compound working for a certain disease, but you have to know so much more about the compound, whether it works at 5 milligrams, 10 milligrams. Does it need to be in a powder form or a liquid form? And it's that, in that phase 1, you're figuring out toxicity, and then phase 2, you're starting to look at dosing. And those micro details, our companies, didn't want our competitors to know. Of course, we wanted them to know if there were unsafe molecules. But nowadays, we live in a very different competitive world. Because we have big data and everything's on the internet now, I would say it's nearly impossible for our competitors not to know exactly what I am doing in every phase 1 trial. In fact, I would say our company and most of the large company has software that crawls the internet and crawls all these different sources to figure out what my phase 1 trials look like. So the incentive to hide is much less now. So that's why my perfect company discloses all clinical trial results, including phase 1.
Okay, but this is a good example to highlight where you might see something like institutional corruption here, because what you've said is that where there was a competitive reason to hide, companies wanted to hide. Mm-hmm. But where there was a competitive reason to hide, there still was a public health reason not to hide. Uh-huh. So there was a misalignment of the incentives. The public health incentives were not aligned with the private competitive incentives. Mm-hmm. Now, you say that the conditions have changed, and at least for your company, there's no longer that misalignment of incentives. But this is a way to begin to identify where we have a reason for intervention like regulation. And of course, since '96, there's been extensive regulation focused exactly in this way to push people to do things that they don't otherwise have the private incentive to do.
Sure. So also, I should say my company is very special. We might be on the leading end of
You certainly are on the leading end, but just because I know
clinical
you
trial
guys don't hear everything that we say in the very beginning, she actually doesn't work for a pharmaceutical company, to make this clear. Okay, sorry.
The majority of companies are struggling to catch up with my company. So we've set this new standard, and it should change the industry. So I expect there to be improvement in this area, especially if we can bring a lot more attention to the good practices. So I'm in favor of naming good practices and shaming bad practices. And if we can do that right now, when it's sort of this tipping point on this issue, I think that we can create change more quickly.
Okay, great. Let's then shift to marketing. So it's a stunning number to recognize, but companies, I'm not sure whether the best company in the world, sorry.
I want to go back to one more thing, because we only talked about disclosing summary results. And if you do know about public health and the way that clinical trial results are disclosed in a trial registry, you know that that is not enough information to guide prescriptions for the doctor or the medical guideline writers. You need the papers, right? And those papers, there's a gatekeeper there. So the company might submit all of my trial results for publication, but it's the journal editors that decide, again, thumbs up, thumbs down on the publication. And let's talk about incentives for the journal editors. The incentives aren't there for them to publish unfavorable or zero results. The articles that sell are the ones that have favorable results. So a lot of companies will submit negative results, and they simply have a hard time getting them published.
So, but that's changing too, because organizations like PLOS with PLOS One basically enable you to publish anything as long as you pass a very minimal test of scientific veracity. So this is technically published then, and it's available, and there's no reason then to be discriminating between that stuff that's being published and that stuff that's not. Right? Okay, so let's talk about marketing. You were trying to avoid the subject by bringing us back. Okay, but I'm not going to let you skip it. Here we go. So it's kind of astonishing when you recognize that most companies, I don't know if the very best company in all of history of the world, which you work for, this is true for them too, but most pharmaceutical companies spend probably twice the amount of money marketing a drug that they do actually developing the drug. And they also use or have used lots of financial incentives in the form of grants or gifts or consulting arrangements or speakers' fees. They have key opinion leaders, KOLs, who they'll come to and say, we really think you're great. We'd like to pay you $20,000 to give a speech at a certain conference about our drug. They pay for continuing medical education of the doctors, pay medical societies. And the concern is that all of these payments, somewhere in the back of the minds of the doctors, can't help but begin to influence them or push them towards the drugs unrelated to the underlying strength or validity or usefulness of the underlying drugs. So these marketing practices tilt the actual adoption of drugs away from what they would be if it weren't for this kind of marketing.
So it's true, a handful of the largest companies, not so much the small companies, do spend double the amount of money marketing drugs than research and developing new ones. But this is on par with this ratio is on par with a lot of other industries. And it's also lower than a lot of industries. The ratio is lower than banks, beverages, apparel, accessories, and luxury goods. And it's lower than many other technology companies, right? So biotech, you're in the tech world. Even the most innovative of technology companies, which spend between 2 to 8 times their revenues on marketing than researching and developing new ones. So who spends double? Merck does. Merck does spend 17% on research and development and about 27, oh, it's not double, about 27% on sales. So Merck's lower than double. Pfizer is double, 14% on R&D, 33% on sales. Biogen, rising superstar, which is local, they spend 24% on R&D and 23% on sales. So it's true for a very small number of outlier companies. Again, not mine. But let's look at other tech companies. What about GE? What does General Electric spend on its research and development? Only 3.2%. What does it spend on sales? 25%. That's 8 times the ratio of research to sales. So what you're really probably...
When's the last time you bought a GE product?
My refrigerator.
Yeah.
Is from General Electric.
Yeah.
It could be. So I think what you're really saying is that maybe the pharmaceutical industry shouldn't be a for-profit entity, right? Maybe it has some different type of, it's a different type of company. It doesn't make widgets, right? It should be something, some new structure. But that's a different question. Since it is a for-profit company right now, that's the way that society has understood it, the democracy has allowed it to grow, it does need to pursue profits. And those profits, it sounds like money, we tend to think of that negatively, but the profits recoup the costs for developing drugs, and then it allows the companies to continue to innovate new drugs. So there is a profit incentive.
So, but it's interesting you said our democracy has let it grow like this.
Oh.
Because in fact, it wasn't the democracy, it was the Supreme Court.
Uh-huh.
And in one of the kind of embarrassing footnotes of history, it was Ralph Nader, right?
Yeah.
So Ralph Nader was responsible for the Supreme Court adopting what became known as the commercial speech doctrine.
Yeah.
And the commercial speech doctrine is a First Amendment protection that had been unknown for most of the history of America for corporations advertising their products. So if you're a corporation advertising your products and the government wants to regulate those advertisements, the government's got to show that there's a very strong interest in regulating that advertisement, and it can never regulate if all the advertisement is trying to do is to provide true information. Now, that sounds good. Yeah, you should be allowed to provide true information. And the original cases where this issue was raised was like restrictions on pharmacy companies advertising low-cost drugs. So it was a good thing to get that information out there because people knew where to go to buy low-cost drugs. But the consequence of it is that these drug companies now are advertising directly to the consumer for these drugs, that then the consumer turns around and goes to the doctor and says, I want you to prescribe these drugs. We saw one of these last week. Lisa had one of these for one of these drugs for depression or something related to depression, I don't remember. But the basic dynamic here is that the relatively uneducated, ordinary public, uneducated at least about what's safe and effective for drugs or appropriate for their particular condition, are riled up to get their doctor to approve for them a particular drug. And the doctor is faced with this difficult decision. He or she says either yes or no. If she says yes, then maybe it's not the best thing for the patient. If she says no, then the patient says, fine, I'll go get another doctor. So what this has done is unleashed a kind of marketing practice that doesn't necessarily drive us to the best mix of drugs that's out there, but drives us to the mix of drugs that produces the most profit. And again, that might not be related to the mix of drugs that's going to be best for the health of the patients.
So did Lisa mention that the United States is one of the only countries that allows direct-to-consumer advertising?
She didn't talk about that at all, but we are talking about it now, and
Yeah.
why don't you say that?
Most countries do not allow direct-to-consumer advertising. We're one of the only countries, if not the only country, but definitely one of the countries that allows that. And
We believe in freedom here.
Well, I'm not sure. This is dictated by the companies at this point, and I'm not sure this will continue. The pharmaceutical industry suffers, as you guys know, from a massive reputation problem, but this wasn't always the case. 16 years ago, we really didn't think that badly about pharmaceutical companies. That's a very complicated question to get into. Why don't we like big pharma anymore? Which I'm not going to get into, but the companies themselves, they think that part of it in the United States has to do with this direct-to-consumer advertising. And the trade association is debating hotly and individual companies are debating whether they should stop this practice in the United States. So we should follow this topic in another 10 years and see what happens with direct-to-consumer advertising.
But that's also, they would face a difficulty in the United States if they agreed not to do direct-to-consumer advertising. That would be a violation of antitrust laws to engage in that agreement, not to do that kind of advertising. So you always have companies in the United States who are facing this competitive pressure to do what everybody else is doing, because it turns out that's very profitable for certain drugs. And Lisa's drug, it was a case where it was basically exactly the same drug, but it was a new version that had a much stronger patent protection. So it's not like they would actually be free not to be doing it if in fact, even if they thought it would be best for the industry as a whole.
So, but let's unpack that. So you're saying that the trade association couldn't put in their code of conduct, look, we've decided it's unethical to do direct-to-consumer advertising because it's unethical. Our members commit not to do it.
Yeah, you can't insulate something from antitrust review by calling it unethical. And so if it was understood to be an agreement not to do this kind of advertising, you can't agree to do, companies can't agree to do, not to do certain kind of advertising. That's what the antitrust agreements rules are all about. So the point is, they can't do it privately.
Together, right.
The First Amendment has been interpreted to say you can't do it legislatively. So we're kind of stuck in this position where neither private nor public intervention can occur to limit what drug companies think is hurting them and what many people think is hurting patients.
That's interesting.
Yeah. You're probably not responsible for the Supreme Court's doctrine, so we won't blame the drug company for that.
So, right. But I want to talk about, so there's direct-to-consumer advertising, but there's also direct-to-doctor advertising, right? The sales reps that visit the physicians in their workplace. That was actually started at the request of the physicians, partly because they wanted to maintain their power and monopoly over the ability to prescribe medicines to patients. So it's very interesting that now suddenly the doctors are pushing back on something that they opened the door to in the 1950s. And all of the marketing events that you talk about when key opinion leaders, KOLs, give speeches to their colleagues about medicines are heavily audited at this point. So most of the lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies have to do with some kind of sales claim issue. And the companies know this, and it costs them billions of dollars. So when they have these events, there's actually an Ernst & Young auditor sitting in the audience, eating the rubbery chicken sandwich and making sure that it's modest and that there aren't undue inducements that are visible to the auditors. So it's a heavily audited and not regulated, but audited space. And you do have recourse to some legal actions in that space. But it's a challenging. That's a challenging issue.
So there's been significant regulation, though, eliminating the ability of companies to give out drugs. Like, for example, in Massachusetts, there's anti-gift law that was passed a couple years ago, and then when the restaurant people complained that it was driving down restaurant consumption during these conventions, the governor said, well, maybe we should step back from this kind of regulation to save the restaurants. But how many, across the country, is this the general norm that there's bans on these gifts now?
Well, it depends. So hospitals have gone ahead individually, right, and they're pharma-free. They don't allow even pens to be circulated. But there's still money being exchanged in universities in various ways. So money hasn't been eliminated, but it's being reduced. And I think, again, we need to track this issue in another 10 years and see where we are on it. But there's a lot of banning of gifts. You can't give gifts. And again, it's in the code of conduct of the trade association. Companies commit not to give doctors directly any gifts. Although the American Academy of Pediatrics code of conduct is very interesting. They don't ban all gifts. They only ban some gifts. So they allow their doctors to take any gift that's educational. So a textbook, a skeleton, some sort hanging up. So sort of interesting that the companies have banned, at least in their code of conduct, giving any gifts to physicians, and the physicians are saying, well, we'll ban some of them, but not all of them.
Yeah, so mummies, costumes for kids at Halloween, those are probably okay.
That wouldn't be educational.
Okay,
yeah.
but if you think back to our Psychology Week, there's actually an interesting story about these gifts. There's some research to suggest that the corrupting influence of gifts is kind of a U-shaped curve. So small gifts and very large gifts are very effective at changing people's behavior, but the sort of intermediate gifts are not. And the reason for that is pretty intuitive. The intermediate gifts, you know you're being bribed, so you're like, whoa, what's going on here? The really big gifts, you know you're being bribed, but you're willing to be bribed because it's a really big gift. And the really small gifts, you can't believe that's actually affecting your behavior, but it certainly is changing something. We can test and see that it's changing something. And so that's why there was this plethora, maybe effective plethora of things like pens and coffee mugs, which you would say, I'm not going to change a prescribing behavior over a coffee mug, but maybe you are, because you don't even realize the way in which it's creating these bonds of loyalty in your...
Yeah, and there was a loophole in the industry's code of conduct where it said you can give gifts up to $100. And then, so what companies did is they gave a lot of gifts at $99. So it added up to more, right? But it was still technically under each gift individually. But that loophole has been closed, at least in the trade association's code of conduct. But what a smart person would ask is that being enforced and applied, and what do those stats look like?
Yeah.
So I encourage you guys to go out and study those stats, because we need them. And I think that while in the US this might be a declining practice, and abroad it may not be. So we just had GSK was dinged for some bribery in China. A couple other companies are having problems abroad. So again, we need to take a more global perspective, and companies need to work on their practices, not just in the United States, but in the other countries as well.
Okay, final issue, accessibility of drugs. So here the charges are a couple, but they all basically are of the communist sort. First, companies are charging unjustly high prices for medicine, viewed as extorting the sick because of those prices. They don't invest in less profitable R&D and adaptive technologies. Instead, they're going to focus on the blockbuster drugs or modifying existing drugs slightly to extend their patent life and thus keep the prices artificially high. And the view of some is that companies should be responsible for more than just making drugs, but also for delivering them. Even if the drugs were free, the big problem, which you adverted to earlier, is the infrastructure and capacity to deliver these drugs. These countries don't have what you called cold chains or electricity to make it possible for you to refrigerate the vaccines that are going to be transported and stored. And then we don't have medicines because of this incentive structure that are necessary for these poor or smaller populations, partly because they lack the purchasing power to incentivize the companies to develop them, but also because these countries need different kinds of drugs. So it might be fine to have vaccines that need to be refrigerated in countries like ours, but in developing countries where there is this lack of electricity, you need to be developing drugs that are more heat stable, have longer shelf lives, or can be delivered in fixed dose combinations rather than imagining somebody taking one drug every day for 13 days or having to come in every day to a clinic when, of course, they have to walk to that clinic and it's many, many miles away. And then finally, your focus is on all these Me Too drugs, which slightly better, certainly good for you because you get a patent on the Me Too that allows you to keep the price high, but doesn't really drive drug development in a way that's going to make sure that we're giving the right kind of availability to the public.
Yeah, so that was a lot in that complaint. So I'll try and go through each one somewhat individually. Let's talk about pricing. Most everywhere outside of the United States, the companies don't set the prices of their drugs. The governments do, the payers. But in the United States, we're rather unique in that the company has more say in the pricing. So we're talking, again, one country out of the many. So how do you set the cost of a medicine? Well, there's at least three things. There's a lot more, but there are at least three main things you want to think about. Recuperating the costs of developing the medicine, recuperating the cost of the failures that went before it in order to get to that medicine, and having a bit of a buffer to continue to innovate in the future to create other medicines. So let's talk about the costs. Developing a drug is actually a very costly gamble. Getting to market takes 10 to 15 years, and if you're granted a patent, it's for about 20 years without extensions, and it costs about $1 billion. For every compound that makes it, 85 to 99% don't, and that's for clinical trials. So we've talked about phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. Those are in people. Before you even get trials in people, you are testing in petri dishes, they're called in vitro studies, in glass, and in animals. So 85 to 99% of compounds fail even after they've made it to human studies. So that just tells you, if you look at the broader view, of how hard it is to create healthcare innovation, these therapies. It's a gamble, to put it mildly. Even if you pass all of these tests, glass to animals, to humans, to patients, and you're that 1%, still, you have about a 50% chance of the FDA approving your drug. So all of those costs and gambles need to be accounted for. Moreover, it's very hard to understand how to price a drug. What if we're talking about an antidepressant and the pill could replace the $400 a week session that you have with a therapist? Does that mean you charge $400 a week for the pill, or do you charge 4 cents? And it's very interesting what we as a society, and we need to have this discussion, are willing to pay for. We're, on average, willing to pay $20,000 for a cancer drug that extends your life 6 months. We are not willing to pay for a $20,000 antibiotic that may save your life for indefinitely. So we have our own value judgments on what we think different drugs should cost. So let's look at what this has done to the antibiotic market. Pfizer got started in the antibiotic business. During World War II, it mass-marketed penicillin to all the Allies. Do you know what? Pfizer does not get involved, for all things considered, in antibiotics anymore because it can't make any money there. And so as a result, a lot of people think that in our lifetime, we will have a public health crisis around the fact that we don't have enough different types of antibiotics to treat the new resistant bugs that are emerging and other new things. So, and then just to cap in the United States, drugs only account for 10 to 14% of the total healthcare costs. So that's the larger question. Again, if you don't think that companies should make any money in the drug development phase, then we really need to talk about having some kind of other entity other than drug companies involved in this space. Because it's in the for-profit sector, it has to make profits, right, for public health reasons, for innovation reasons, but because it's a company and it needs to pay its employees and everything else.
But wait, are you really conceding a very important point here, which is if you think the objective of public health and drug companies in public health is to advance quality of lives lived, are you conceding that privately funded drugs don't do that?
What do you mean by privately
Well, I
funded
mean,
drugs?
you said if you don't want them to make money, then we could do it as a public service. But if we did it as a public service, are you conceding that, in fact, we would? No, you're not going to concede that. You'd be fired if you conceded that.
No, because there would be efficiency questions, and it would be a much more complicated issue. So you would have to ask what type of institution would maximize public health, and that would be a big modeling question that you would need to do, which I haven't done. But I think, again, someone should sit down and model those. Probably somebody has. I'm not familiar with that part of the debate at this point. Again, ask me in 10 years. But then let's go back to the pharmaceutical industry. What is the number one industry that's had the most impact, that's advanced, one of the highest impacts on advancing global health from an industry perspective? What's the industry with the most positive global impact on health?
Lawyers.
Who work for the pharmaceutical industry,
I see.
maybe. Yeah. It's the pharmaceutical industry. So they've done a lot of good. They're also, at least a lot of companies claim that the pharmaceutical industry is the number one provider of free medicines, more than all the other governments and NGOs added up together. Now, I have not double-checked this calculation, so I encourage you all to double-check that. But that is certainly a very public claim that most executives at pharmaceutical companies make. In fairness, this benefits some of the companies. They get tax breaks for giving away free medicines, and a small portion of that might be samples, right? So free samples, which are part of marketing. But it's still the number one provider of free medicines, according to companies. It can always do more, but I think we'll always demand more of companies. So it's really hard to understand at what point we'd say, yeah, you've done enough. Yay, we love you now, right? So.
Okay. You've done an admirable job. And I want to make sure that if there are questions that people want to ask right now, we have a chance to ask them. Yes, back here.
Yeah, so my question was going back to the third point, which is the clinical trial sort of results and the disclosure of the results. So, Professor Lessig, you sort of made this distinction that there's, when some companies don't disclose, there's a conflict between the private corporate interests and the general public health interests. But I wonder, and maybe you could comment on this, if part of the reason that those disclosures exist, and you did sort of bring this up, is that there are, incentives for the companies, in terms of their competitiveness to try and withhold those, so that, if you have a small pharma or a biotech and they have some sort of new way of approaching, a drug or a solution to a medical issue, they don't disclose, with the hope that, they can potentially get bought out and they're made big. So the disclosure, not disclosing, actually sort of promotes innovation on behalf of looks like it isn't helping the public good, but on a long term, sort of projected outwards, because there's so many more ideas in the marketplace of development that you actually come out with more drugs that serve the public good.
So maybe, but it's really important to recognize how contingent that claim is, right? So think about patents. The patent length, is around 17 years, 20 years in some contexts. So let's say it's 20 years. If you told a company the patent that you would get a patent for 100 years, that would be a greater incentive to the company. So on the margin, the company would have more incentive to innovate. But the deadweight loss, the cost of that 100-year patent, would wildly swamp any gain you would get from innovation. So just looking at the margin about how you might benefit some more innovation if you kept some information out doesn't answer the question whether on balance it helps. And in this context, it's pretty sharp if hiding this information leads to certain people dying when they're being tested for drugs. You've got a pretty heavy burden to bear to show that the marginal increase in innovation outweighs the cost from that dying.
Yeah, and I would just add, I'm going to take off my pharma hat and put on my ethicist hat. What we need to have is a discussion on which clinical trial results we want to have public, right? Because legally, we're already requiring the disclosure of controlled phase 2 and 3 trials. Granted, it's only 20% of the world of trials that are done. But those 20% are generally disclosed. So you're really talking about, does the world benefit if that 80% is hidden or disclosed? And that's something we haven't talked about as a society. But the company, in some ways, makes the decision about whether it's going to disclose the clinical trial results before it knows what the results are going to be, which is very interesting. Because before it starts its clinical trial, it will either register the trial or not register. And in the beginning, there's an incentive to register because it's one of the ways that you advertise, we have a trial, healthy people or patients come sign up for our trial. When you don't register your trial, it makes it harder to recruit research subjects. So then you have a record of the trial at the outset. After the trial's over, you go back to that register and you put your results in. So so meaning to say that decision in some ways is made before you know about the results of the trial.
Other question right here? Yes, you, right there.
So about accessibility, you mentioned that in terms of getting drugs approved, it usually goes like US, Europe, Japan. Is that true of drugs for diseases like tuberculosis, where the preponderance of cases are involved?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I haven't looked at exactly the regulatory order for neglected diseases or tropical diseases or those types of things. However, I will tell you that the United States, the FDA is usually a leading regulator that other regulators follow. And part of that is because we're the only regulator in the world that gets access to the actual patient-level data, and the other ones get summary results. So it would behoove you to get approval in the United States, and then sort of a lot of the other smaller regulators will follow. But I don't know, if there's a drug that only impacts the developing world if they seek regulatory approval in the U.S. It's a really good question.
One last question over there. Yes, you.
You mentioned the number of ways in which the United States is different from other countries. Now, when in these other countries, do we see the same number of drugs being approved, and do we see, is there anything that is
You mean in terms of approval?
approval?
Yeah.
And just like the quality of drugs that
The rigor with which we review the information about drugs. Again, we're the only regulatory body that gets the patient-level data. That means they say, Susie, Sally, and Billy took drug X at 5 milligrams, and then they had a headache, and then they had this and that. And so the FDA gets all of that information, where the EMA, which is the FDA in Europe, gets largely aggregated summary results. So it's questioned whether, so US-centric vision would say, are they as rigorous as the US? that answer your question, at least partly? Yeah.
So can you stay for a couple of minutes? Okay, so first, we're going to stop. People have more questions. Jennifer's going to stay for a couple of minutes, but I want you to join me in thanking Jennifer for this really fantastic talk.